All right. So, everybody, thanks so much for listening. If you're listening to us on one of the radio stations, we greatly appreciate it. And please tell your family and friends, whatever market you're listening to, that you're listening to our program. If you want this show to be in another market, definitely call up the radio station that you are listening to and tell them about it. Try to give us some good publicity. We appreciate that. For a lot of our friends that do listen to on the podcasting sites, on the YouTube, we appreciate that also. And please subscribe, like, and share. Very important. I'll say that one more time. Subscribe, like the program, share it to your friends and family. That makes sure that the people we get interviewed get more publicity. It also gives more publicity to our show. Really working hard on that as far as the podcasting sites go. That's where most of the viewership does listen. So we're trying our best to do that. But again, we also appreciate our radio listeners. Moving into the interview, we have a special guest on today. It's David Richards. He is a man of many traits. He's done many things in his life, and we'll talk about that as the interview goes on. If you want to find more about David, you can go to this website. It's davidrichardsauthor.com. Again, davidrichardsauthor.com. David, first of all, thanks so much for getting on here, and we're looking forward to this conversation and also the next one.
Rob, thank you so much for having me on. Happy holidays to you and your family. It's a thrill and an honor to be with you. So thank you so much.
Let's kick this around. So tell the viewers a little bit about yourself. I know you were in the military. If you can go into that and also how your career changed after that.
Yeah, so I was actually born into a military family. My dad was in the Marines for 31 years, and that is a really unique lifestyle. Especially, we spent most of the time growing up on military bases. That is a completely different experience because most bases are their own self-contained city. And because everyone's on the same team, so to speak, it's a really, really safe environment and safe neighborhood. Like, people leave their doors open. They're just, crime is almost negligible on a military base. The downside is we moved around a lot. And as a kid, for me, that was very disruptive because I would throw myself into my friendships and relationships, and then 2 years later, they would be torn apart. And that was hard for me to kind of grab with initially. As I got into high school, I had success with English. I got a couple of stories published. I got a national recognition for a short story. I got some poetry that won contests. And that's kind of what I wanted to do. But because of the military thing, you don't spend a lot of time doing career planning or college progression, what that whole situation looks like. So not knowing what else to do, I went to college with an ROTC scholarship, and that is basically a path or pipeline into the military. Joined the Marines for 15 years and kind of realized that I was living my dad's blueprint of life, and that was sort of the model that I had taken, and I wanted to figure out what life was like on the other side of a military base and outside of uniform. So I made the decision in 2006 to get out. Instantly fell in love with yoga while I was at the same time landing a corporate gig with the Fortune 500 company. And that really transformed my life. And I would say for the first 5 or 6 years of being out, like on a weekly basis, I would compare what happened in corporate America that week to what I was familiar with in the military, and just start to like try to make sense of it, because learning the civilian world after basically spending 36 years in the military was a very different experience.
Oh, wow. Wow. I didn't see you in the military for 36 years.
Well,
Wow.
I include my time as a
Oh, with
child
your
too.
time
Yeah.
with your dad
Yeah,
and stuff.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, for sure. Because we lived in Japan for 3 years, and that's, you just don't get those experiences.
Right.
And at the same time, you're still in the military base, and you realize how kind of far-reaching the U.S. military is.
Can you talk about your time in the military a little bit before we move into the yoga aspect of this?
Yeah, so I was commissioned in 1991, ancient history for some people, but I went into the artillery. So that's big guns that blow stuff up from very far away. And it was cool because to me, that was, my dad had been in the infantry in Vietnam, and I don't think that I wanted to get that kind of exposure. But to me, artillery was almost the next best thing, because artillery changed battles. And I was fortunate that I got to go to Somalia as part of the initial landing force of Operation Restore Hope in December of 1992. So just 30 years ago this month. And that was fascinating because I was one of probably the first 50 Marines ashore to launch that operation. And obviously, if people have heard of or seen the movie Black Hawk Down, it didn't end on a positive note, but it certainly started with good intentions when we landed there. So came back from that and kind of just moved around every 2 or 3 years, moved around just like I'd done growing up, and went back and forth between the West Coast and the East Coast, spent some time in California, then South Carolina, then Virginia, back to California, back to Virginia, finally Florida. And my last assignment, I was doing a lot of work in Central America. And that was around the time when I realized I wanted to do something else.
And this is around 2006, then you're saying?
Yep, 2005, 2006. Yep.
So I assume that you still have family and friends that are in the military, correct?
Um, they are. I have certainly have friends who are veterans. Most of my peer group are retired from the military. If they'd elected to stay in, there might be one or two who are still in and who've made it to the general rank. So they're generals in the Marines now. So I've got a couple buddies there. Yeah.
Can you talk about how the military has changed since when you started serving to when you retired? Even if you're, obviously speaking to your buddies of how they say it's changed. There's a lot of talk between, I don't want to go too political into this, but there is a lot of talk, whatever side you're on, that the military has changed since, like you said, the time you've been in up until now.
Oh, for sure. I mean, certainly one of the biggest changes would have to be women being able to serve in combat. And
Right.
the U.S. was slow to make that change. But I mean, if you look at other services like the Israeli Defense Force, women have been serving in combat effectively there for decades. So that's one of the changes. Certainly the transition to drone warfare or sort of this long distance warfare has been a big change too. And honestly, it's one of the things that we started to become aware of as I was going up through the ranks was warfare isn't just tanks and guns and bullets. There's economic warfare. And if you look at what happened with the Russia-Ukrainian war, a few weeks into the war, lots of American corporations pulled out of Russia as a financial or economic penalty against what Russia was doing. And that is at least in my memory, that's kind of one of the first instances where you really saw something like that happen, because we've had a global economy for a while. And so a penalty for disrupting the world order could be economic sanctions like that. But really the biggest change I would say is just how pervasive with cyber attacks, those kind of things, how the battleground has shifted. And it's not necessarily about boots on ground as much as it is about protecting cybersecurity and not worrying about deep fakes and things like that. So it's really been the advance and integration of technology into the military service that's probably brought the biggest change.
Well, and I want to end with this last question on the military topics.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that we are, or maybe we're already there, moving toward that type of not nuclear war? It's more of that cyber attacks, technology war, not, more so nukes and, boots on the ground. It's the drones and the tech.
It's a great question. The answer comes down to what the objectives are. And typically, certainly one of the biggest things that's changed is for 20 years, we were at war in Afghanistan. We had a presence in Iraq, and that led us through just volumes of evolution in terms of street fighting, in terms of dealing with insurgencies, in terms of pacifying populations and trying to form stable governments and things like that. In order to do something where you're going to occupy a country like we did with Iraq or Afghanistan, you need boots on the ground. I mean, that's just a matter of recourse. When you look at what our relationship with China or, with Russia, certainly now, you start to look at the other facets of power and how you wage warfare. And it could be cyber attacks. It could be cyber terrorism. I mean, there's eco-terrorism is a thing where I saw there was recently some attacks on, I want to say, some infrastructure. And so that's something else that you just need to be aware of is it could be, I mean, I remember when I was in school in the Marines, one of my classmates did his thesis on um, basically pyroterrorism. Like, could someone come in and set our forests to burn? And could that be a form of terrorism? And he ended up going to the U.S. Forestry Service to kind of brief them on what his approach was. So as we've evolved now, you're right, it is less about nuclear war because no one wants that. And there's enough countries that have tons of nukes that we realize that's hopefully people, it always comes back to mutually assured destruction, and this idea that if one person launches a nuclear weapon, then someone else does, then the whole thing is up. So it comes down to, are there less severe and yet still more effective means of conducting warfare? And economics could be that, and certainly cyber terrorism or cyber attacks could be something like that too.
Yeah. And again, for people listening, davidrichardsauthor.com. David, let's kick this around into this next segment. Going into your story, you moved into corporate America. You kind of dabbled a little bit about that and what you did there. And then how did the yoga start? Because a lot of people look at yoga and they just think of woman in yoga pants, which is definitely not what we hope the objective is to this. We hope that it's, you're doing this because it's good for your health. I mean, it's nice to see the woman, but yeah, besides that, but go ahead.
Yeah, I did not start taking yoga classes to meet women. Well, no. So honestly, what happened was the weekend I got out of the Marines, I left Miami and I came to where my parents lived in North Carolina, because that was, my job was going to be in North Carolina, but I was going to live in Virginia Beach for my first year. So I came to North Carolina, and I just happened to read a Sports Illustrated magazine article about NFL players. I think it was someone from the Arizona Cardinals using yoga to strengthen their core. And so as a Marine, I was like, tough, rugged NFL players can do yoga. Maybe I should check it out. And honestly, part of it too was, Rob, when I lived in Japan, getting the exposure to Eastern philosophy and Eastern culture at such a young age, that had a big impression on me. Like I was at least exposed to Buddhism, the idea of meditation, that there was an inner stillness that you could achieve, and that would somehow lead to some kind of fulfillment or growth. And I remember when I was in high school and I came back to the United States after 3 years in Japan, like Friday nights, my friends would be out at football games or going out to get drunk at the beach or whatever. And I would be trying to meditate in my parents' living room. Like, that was kind of my thing. So I read this article and I thought, you know what? I lift weights still. Maybe yoga will help me with my flexibility. So that weekend I took my first class, and it was a gentle class, and I was the only guy in the class. And if you're not familiar with yoga, gentle yoga is kind of the mildest form of yoga that you can experience. It's no stress on the body. It's not intended to be stressful. It's just really kind of this flow. And so I did the first class, and I had mixed feelings about it because I don't know that I felt any different. It wasn't hard. Right. And I didn't know what I was expecting, but I was like, okay, maybe I'll try it again. So I waited a day or two. I went back to a class, a couple days later, and it was a different style of yoga, different instructor. And we're probably 30 or 40 minutes into class, and I am drenched in sweat. And just from moving, like, that's the thing. Yoga is just basically moving around. And I was like, how is this possible? Like, what is going on? And I remember we're trying to do this weird contortion where you got your legs are spread out on the mat, one leg's forward, one leg's back, and you're trying to bind your arms. Like, you bring one arm under one leg and then you bring the other arm behind you, and you're trying to bring your hands together. And I couldn't do it. And I was just like, my shoulders were too tight or whatever. And so I'm watching the sweat just pour onto the mat in front of me. And the instructor comes by, this beautiful woman, and she just gently whispers to me, use your hand towel. And so I grab my hand towel and I wipe my face from all the sweat. And she looks at me and she's like, use your hand towel to bind your hands. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I bind my hands, and we finish class, and every yoga class typically ends the same way, with what's called shavasana, or corpse pose, where you just lie down and you're still for 3 to 5 minutes, depending on how long the instructor has you stay in the pose. And the big shift for me, what really got me hooked with yoga, was my last assignment in the Marines, as I said, I spent a lot of time in Honduras. I was in Panama, helping those militaries and governments try to modernize their military. And I might get 50 email a week. I mean, just email was not a big part of my life back then. Mm. When I switched to corporate America and I was working for an IT company, I would get 50 email in 2 hours. And so by the end of the day, I would drive home and my mind was like a radio station that was like in between stations. It was just reminders and to-do lists and things I forgot to do and things I had to do tomorrow. And it was just this noise, this incredible amount of noise in my head. And what I found when I got into yoga and onto the mat specifically was that noise went away and it was quiet. And so the first Shavasana or the second Shavasana, I was like, what is that? What is that stillness? Because I want more of that in my life. Like that is something that is good and it feels good. And within 3 or 4 classes, I was hooked. And a year later, I became an instructor. And then I've been teaching since 2007.
Can you talk about how yoga and meditation in general is very good for men and specifically their mental health and helping them grow as individuals in life?
I love the way you approach this, Rob, because for so many men, they don't want to talk about feelings and they don't want to talk about what goes on in their head. Like that is sacred ground to most men. It's like, don't tell me what my voices in my head or my voices are saying to me or telling me. That's my business. And let's look at it from a biologic standpoint first. Biologically speaking, we know that the separation between the hemispheres of the brain in men is more significant. For women, it's less noticeable. Like the women have an actual connection between the two hemispheres of the brain. What does that mean? Most men live on the left side of the brain because that's the analytical, practical side of the brain. They shut down from childhood the creative or right side of the brain because that's the side that sparks imagination and creativity and artistry and feelings to a large extent. And so men shut that off because that's bad or that's weakness, especially in the tribe of men. And men hold each other accountable in a way. And if you start to get too soft, and certainly I saw this in the Marine Corps, like I remember when I got 2 master's degrees while I was in the Marines, and one was a class that everyone kind of went to when you get to a certain point in your career. The second one you had to apply for, and it was a really exclusive, like 10% of the applicants got accepted. Like 200 people applied, and they accepted 24 people. And my professor, my Marine officer instructor, who was my professor, submitted some of my poetry with part of my application. And I remember when my fellow Marines found out that I wrote poetry, they're like, "Are you gay?" And I was like, and for me, it was weird because in one sense, I understood the question because it's the Marine Corps and it is like, there's something Spartan about the Marines. Like the harder it is, the more like we'll do it. Like it's this mindset kind of like, there's nothing that we can't defeat or conquer. But I was surprised because I'm like, part of me saw that approach, but the other part of me was like, my ability to express myself creatively has nothing to do with my sexuality. Like I'm lovingly heterosexual. But it was fascinating to me that was kind of the approach. So when I got into yoga, you're right. What I found was there weren't a lot of men in yoga classes. And then when I started to meet men, when I started to get really into the community and started to meet some of the instructors who were men, you realize there is a strength from accepting kind of both aspects of you. And what I mean by that is we are all born of masculine and feminine.
Yes.
Like we're all born of a man and woman. That is like there's no controversy about that, right? So what that means is
I don't know now, but
that's
with
fair.
us.
That's fair.
Yeah, but now apparently there is. But go ahead.
That's fair. But we all have masculine and feminine energy in us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of it. And that's
correct.
It's easy for men in the tribe of men to subdue the feminine and objectify it as something external to them. And whether it's mom or whether it's girlfriend or wife or whatever, it's very easy. But that's why men struggle in communication and communicating their feelings, because they're like, they don't think they're supposed to have them. And I remember the first few times when I would go to like weekend yoga retreats and see the same men that I'd seen, or I'd gone to these people's classes. And I mean, that's the other thing too. People don't understand, like, yoga is hard. Like, yoga can be incredibly challenging. I mean, I've been to a class where I've seen someone do a one-armed handstand where they're just holding themselves up completely by one arm. I've seen someone be like, in an upside down position where they're like basically doing, I don't remember, the kids use a somersault or something, upside down somersault, and then stand up. I mean, so yoga is about incredible body discipline and strength. And I remember when the first few times, like, these guys would see me and they'd hug me, I was like, oh, what are you guys doing? But you realize it's not about sexuality. It's about like embracing who you are. And I remember, I'll never forget the first few times I heard women in yoga classes refer to themselves as goddesses. I was like, that's awesome. Like, that is so cool. But you never hear men refer to themselves as gods. And it's like, it's interesting. It's an interesting dichotomy. But for me, the biggest takeaway was yoga is a way to strengthen yourself. You can say mentally, physically. I look at it as spiritually. And the whole premise behind yoga is we are not the mind, we're not the body, we're something behind it. And these are vehicles that we use to navigate the material world. And for a lot of men, even people who consider themselves religious, they don't look at their inside world as importantly as they do the outside world. And that's the challenge that I see with a lot of American masculinity.
For everybody again that's listening, davidrichesauthor.com. Definitely check this out. Let's wind down the interview here because we are going to have you on again a couple more times. And we do know people that are listening, whatever realm they're listening on, they do have not the greatest attention span. So that's life in America right now. So
Yep.
uh, we will go down here with the last few parts of the interview. So David, you've written quite a few books right now, and I know there's more coming through the pipeline. As we go to the end, can you tell people a little bit about them, a little bit of a synopsis as we go to the end of this interview?
Yeah, so I wanted to be a horror writer when I was in high school. I love Stephen King and I love like Frankenstein. And so I set writing aside while I was in the military, except the last 5 years or so, I started writing poetry again. And then when I got out and realized that I wasn't going to be moving around, I knew I could start writing again. So for 11 years, I worked on trying to write a horror story, and I wrote 400 pages.
Wow.
Over the span of that 11 years, 4 different stories, never got anywhere off the ground. In 2016, at Christmas time, I read Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, and that book set me on a different path. And so my first book, Whiskey and Yoga, came out in 2017. It's about finding your purpose in life. It's a really quick read. It's about 142 pages, but you can read it in a couple hours. My next book was heavily influenced by yoga. It's called The Lighthouse Keeper. And it's this idea that your mind is an ocean, and that's where all your memories are stored. And your awareness, where you put your focus, is a lighthouse. And most people go through their lives and just kind of put the lighthouse on autopilot. But if you really want to create and design your life to have fulfillment and have all your dreams, kind of fulfilled, you have to start to direct that awareness, that lighthouse, to where you want it to go, so you can control your destiny and shape your destiny. And then my last book just came out at the beginning of this month, called Love Letters to the Virgin Mary, The Resurrection of King David. It's basically, if anyone's seen the recent Planet of the Apes movies, where this ape Caesar realizes that he has to lead his people to the promised land. It's like that, except for gods. And it's a man who wakes up and realizes that he's a god, and then he has to figure out how to bring the rest of the population of the planet to godhood as well. So it's a pretty cool story. Thor's in it, the god of thunder. So yeah, it's good.
Again, davidrichesauthor.com. Definitely check him out. Check out all those books that he just recited just now. Where else can they find you besides the website? Any kind of social media?
Yeah,
Or
so
no?
LinkedIn, okay. David Richards, Instagram, David Richards Author. And then if you want to go on Facebook, the best place to find me is Lifting the Hammer, is the best thing to search for there.
All right. All right. And we hope people look at those social media sites, get in contact with you, David. Again, this is not the last time. This is the first time. And I look forward to doing this again.
Rob, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much,
And
and happy
again,
holidays.
And sorry to interrupt, but thanks so much for your service. We didn't say that, but we will say that now.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on.